It was an old cabin tucked away in a quiet part of the English countryside, somewhere between the small town of Ashcombe and the rolling hills of Dartmoor. I've been meaning to get away for a while. The stress of work, the constant noise of the city, and the never-ending buzz of my phone had all been getting to me. I needed peace, quiet, and a break from the chaos of everyday life. So, I decided to book this cabin for a weekend, thinking it would be the perfect place to relax, read, and maybe get a bit of writing done. The cabin itself wasn't much. A simple, single-story structure made of wood, with ivy creeping along the sides. It had an old-world charm to it, though, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a period drama. The stone fireplace in the living room looked like it could have been there for centuries, and the creaky floorboards gave the whole place a lived-in, nostalgic feel. It was the sort of place where you could hear the wind howling outside, but inside, everything was still, almost too still. I arrived on Friday afternoon, unpacked my bag, and took a walk around the property. The air was crisp, the sky a pale blue, with just a few clouds drifting lazily across the horizon. The trees around the cabin were bare, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. It was exactly what I needed. I didn't see another soul as I made my way along the small dirt paths, listening to the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. There was a small stream at the edge of the property that ran quietly, and I found a spot to sit by the water and let my thoughts wander. That evening, I lit the fireplace, brewed a cup of tea, and curled up on the couch with a book. The cabin was cozy, but the isolation began to settle in around me as the night wore on. As the last of the daylight faded, the house grew darker, and the wind outside began to pick up, making the trees creak and groan in the distance. It was peaceful, yes, but also unnervingly quiet. Around midnight, I woke up with a start. I had been drifting in and out of sleep, but something had stirred me awake. The cabin felt heavier somehow, as if it were holding its breath. I lay there for a few moments, listening to the wind rattle the windows, but there was something else. A sound that didn't belong. A low thud, almost like footsteps. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the house settling or the wind playing tricks on me. But as I listened, the sound came again. It was soft but deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, waiting. Another thud, this time closer. My instincts told me to get up and check, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, perhaps a fox or a badger wandering around outside. But deep down, I knew something was off. The feeling in the pit of my stomach told me this wasn't just some innocent creature. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and slowly got out of bed. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I made my way to the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. But when I opened the door and stepped outside onto the porch, I saw nothing, just the emptiness of the night, stretching out in all directions. I stood there for a while, listening to the wind and straining my eyes to make out any movement. But there was nothing. I began to think I had imagined the whole thing, the result of too much quiet and too little sleep. But as I turned to head back inside, I saw something in the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was just a shadow, barely visible against the dark backdrop of the forest. But the way it stood still, unmoving, sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't make out any features, but the shape was unmistakably human. My first instinct was to run back inside and lock the door, but something held me there, frozen in place. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was fear. Either way, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was then that I noticed something even stranger. The man, or whatever it was, wasn't moving. He just stood there, facing me, like he was waiting. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I felt the weight of his gaze from where I stood. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step backward. The flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows along the porch. I tried to call out, but my voice was trapped in my chest, thick with dread. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure began to move. Slowly, as if he were gliding, he stepped forward, and that was when I saw it. A long, dark coat hanging loosely from his frame. The air felt colder as he walked toward me, the thud of his steps on the ground now unmistakable. I couldn't bring myself to turn and run. My feet were glued to the spot. Just as he reached the edge of the porch, he stopped. There was a long pause, and I held my breath, hoping beyond reason that he would turn and walk away. But instead, the figure tilted his head slightly, as though studying me. Then, with no further warning, he stepped into the shadows of the forest, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. I stayed outside for a while longer, too scared to go back inside immediately. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands shaking. I checked the surrounding area for any sign of him, but there was nothing.
No footprints.
No disturbances in the leaves. It was as if the whole thing had been a bad dream. Eventually, I retreated back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. I felt exposed, vulnerable in the silence of the night. The wind outside howled louder now, almost as if to drown out the sound of my thoughts. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the window, made me jump. I kept expecting the man to appear again, but he didn't. Morning came and I tried to push the incident from my mind. Maybe it had been a trick of the light or some figment of my overactive imagination. I wasn't sure, but as I stepped outside to grab some fresh air, I noticed something odd. Footprints. They weren't far from the porch, just off to the side, leading toward the trees where the figure had stood the night before. They were large, deep, and fresh, as though someone had walked there recently. My breath caught in my throat again as I stared at them. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, and they weren't mine. I followed them for a bit, my heart racing in my chest, but the trail led into the dense undergrowth and I quickly lost it. I stood there for a while, staring at the trees, but no one appeared. It was just the same quiet forest, the same silence. I spent the rest of the weekend inside the cabin, never once stepping outside after dark. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was nothing to fear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that someone had been there the entire time. When I left on Sunday afternoon, I made sure to lock the cabin tightly behind me, my eyes scanning the woods one last time. I drove away, the quiet road stretching out ahead of me, but I couldn't forget that feeling. The feeling that, even now, something or someone was still out there, waiting. I've been fishing for as long as I can remember. It's the one thing that's always been constant in my life, no matter how much time passed. When I was a kid, my dad used to take me out to the lake near our house every weekend. As I got older, I started going alone, enjoying the quiet, the solitude. There's something about being out on the water, away from everything, that just makes the world feel right. So when my old buddy, Greg, suggested a weekend trip up to his family's cabin near a remote lake in Montana, I jumped at the chance. It was early fall, the air was crisp, and the leaves were already turning. Perfect fishing weather. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest paved road. Greg had been coming up here since he was a kid, and he knew the area well. He told me the lake was full of big bass and trout, barely touched by other fishermen. It sounded like paradise. We packed up my truck with all the gear we'd need. Rods, tackle boxes, coolers full of food and beer, and a few sleeping bags since the cabin didn't have much in the way of furniture. Greg said the place had been in his family for decades, but it hadn't been used much in recent years. It took us nearly 6 hours to get there. The last stretch of road was nothing but dirt and rocks, winding through thick trees with no signs of civilization in sight. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, I could tell it had been a while since anyone stayed there. The wood was weathered and gray, the windows were caked with dust, and the front porch sagged a little. Still, it was sturdy enough. Inside, it was simple. Just a couple of wooden chairs, an old table, and a small fireplace. The air was stale, but nothing a little fresh air wouldn't fix. After unloading our stuff, we headed straight for the lake. It was about a quarter mile from the cabin, down a narrow trail through the trees. When we reached the water, I was stunned. The lake was absolutely beautiful, completely untouched. Not a single dock or house in sight, just endless trees reflecting on the surface. We fished for hours. The fish were biting like crazy, just as Greg promised. Every few minutes, one of us was reeling in a good-sized bass or trout. It was one of the best fishing days I'd ever had. As the sun started to set, we headed back to the cabin. Greg started a fire while I cleaned and gutted the fish. The whole place smelled like wood smoke and fresh fish frying in butter. We ate until we couldn't move, then sat on the porch drinking beer, watching the stars. It was one of those nights where everything just felt right. The air was cool, the fire crackled, and the only sounds were crickets and the occasional splash from the lake. Then, somewhere deep in the woods, I heard something. It wasn't an animal. I know what deer and coyotes sound like. This was different. It was a slow, deliberate rustling, like something heavy moving through the trees. Greg heard it too. He glanced at me, but neither of us said anything. We just sat there listening. The sound lasted for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Probably just a bear, I told myself, or maybe a moose. Nothing to worry about. Eventually, we went inside, shut the door, and crashed for the night. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was pitch black inside the cabin. Something had woken me up, but I wasn't sure what. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful steps just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps moved along the porch, then stopped right outside the door. Greg was still asleep. I could hear his slow, steady breathing. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding. Whoever or whatever was outside stood there for a long time. I could hear them breathing, just a faint, steady inhale and exhale. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, slowly fading into the trees. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I told Greg what I'd heard. He shrugged it off, said it was probably just a deer, but I wasn't so sure. We spent the day fishing again, but something felt off. The woods seemed different. The air felt heavier, the silence deeper. Every now and then, I caught myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching us from the trees. I tried to shake it off. We were out in the middle of nowhere. Of course, it was going to feel a little eerie. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. They circled the cabin, moving slowly, like whoever it was wanted us to know they were there. Greg heard it too. He sat up, staring at the door. The breathing came back, right outside the window this time. We didn't move. We just sat there, listening. Then, without warning, something yanked the door handle. Hard. I grabbed my knife from my bag, my hands shaking. Greg grabbed his hunting rifle. The door held. Whoever it was didn't try again. Instead, the footsteps moved away, back into the woods. We didn't sleep after that. By morning, we'd made up our minds. We were leaving. We packed up fast, barely speaking. I didn't even bother cleaning up the cabin. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. As we loaded the truck, I glanced toward the tree line. That's when I saw them. A figure half hidden behind a tree watching us. They weren't wearing bright clothes like a hiker or a hunter, just dark, ragged clothing. Their face was pale, almost gray. They didn't move. didn't wave, just watched. I didn't say anything. I just threw the last of our gear into the truck and got in. As we drove away, I looked in the mirror. The figure was still there, standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. I don't know who they were. I don't want to know. But I'll tell you this, I'll never go back to that cabin again. I took the night shift because it paid extra. Simple as that. I never cared about the job itself. Security guard for a stretch of unused land deep in the woods. Some company had bought up a bunch of property and planned to build a retreat out here, but construction got delayed. In the meantime, they wanted someone to patrol at night, make sure no squatters moved in, no kids came out here to get drunk, that sort of thing. Sounded easy. Just sit in a truck, check a few cameras, walk the property now and then. I didn't mind being alone, and I didn't scare easy. The job didn't even come with a gun, just a flashlight and a radio in case of emergencies. The nearest town was a good 40 minutes away, and I figured if something really bad happened, I'd just hop in my truck and leave. The property itself was nothing special. A dirt road led off the highway, winding through thick trees for about 2 miles before opening up into a clearing. There were a few unfinished buildings out here, a half-built lodge, a couple of frame houses that never got finished. But the place that stuck out the most was the cabin. It was old, much older than the rest of the structures. The company didn't build it. It had been there before, hidden in the trees, half swallowed by overgrown grass. They left it alone, probably figuring they'd just tear it down when construction actually started. Until then, it sat there, empty and rotting, a reminder that this land used to belong to someone else. The first few nights were boring. Just me, my truck, and the rain. It had been coming down steady all week, turning the dirt road into thick mud. The cameras were mounted on poles, but half of them were already dead by the time I got there. That left me with just a few working ones. One pointed at the entrance, one near the unfinished buildings, and one that happened to catch the edge of the old cabin. I didn't think much about the place at first. I didn't have a reason to go near it. But then, about a week in, I started noticing little things. At first, it was just the feeling that something was off. Like when you're being watched, even though you know you're alone. I brushed it off. My mind playing tricks on me. Nothing new. But then I saw the door. I swore it had been closed. The camera barely caught the edge of the cabin, but I was sure when I started my shift, the door had been shut. An hour later, I glanced at the screen and saw it was open, just a crack. Maybe the wind, I thought, but the rain wasn't letting up, and there wasn't much wind at all. I told myself I'd check it out during my next patrol. By the time I got to the cabin, the rain was coming down in thick sheets, hammering against the trees. My boots sank into the mud, and the air smelled like wet leaves and old wood. The cabin sat just inside the tree line, barely visible from the main clearing. I stepped up onto the porch, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The door was open just like I'd seen on the camera. I pushed it the rest of the way with my foot. The inside was what I expected. Dust, broken furniture, an old wood stove in the corner. The place smelled damp, like the walls were soaked through from years of rain. I took a quick look around, checking for footprints in the dust. Any sign that someone had been there. Nothing. The place was empty. Still, I shut the door tight before heading back to my truck. That should have been the end of it. But when I checked the cameras again, the door was open. I felt my stomach drop. I had just shut that door. No wind, no animals. Nothing should have been able to open it again. I should have left it alone. I should have ignored it and gone about my night. But instead, I grabbed my flashlight and went back out into the rain. The door was wide open when I got there. I stepped inside, shining my light across the room. Still empty, but now the air felt heavier, thicker, like the whole cabin was holding its breath. I walked through the small space, checking the corners. The floor creaked under me. The rain beat against the roof. I was about to turn around when I noticed something. The dust. It was thick, untouched, except for where I had walked earlier. But now there was another set of footprints. Not mine. Bare feet. They led from the doorway to the far corner of the room. But there was nothing there. Just empty space. I felt my skin prickle. I followed the tracks with my light, heart pounding in my chest. They stopped at the wall like whoever made them had just disappeared. I backed up, stepping out of the cabin and into the rain. I didn't bother closing the door this time. I just walked straight back to my truck and locked the doors. I kept my eyes on the camera feed, watching the edge of the screen where the cabin sat. The door stayed open, rain blowing in, but nothing moved. I told myself it was fine. Maybe the prints had always been there, and I just didn't notice them the first time. Maybe the door was warped from the rain, swinging open on its own. I tried to convince myself of that. Then, just before sunrise, I saw something. The camera facing the entrance picked up movement. Not a person, not an animal. Just something shifting in the trees. A shape too far back to make out. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It just stood there, barely visible through the rain. Watching, I didn't take the night shift again. It was late October when I decided to head up to the cabin with my brother-in-law, Jake. We'd been talking about it for months, and I needed a break from the city. Jake was a cop, and with his schedule, he didn't often get much time off. But when he did, he liked to get away from the noise. It was a small cabin tucked away in a remote corner of the woods, about 2 hours outside of town. A place far enough from civilization to give you some space to breathe, but close enough that if something went wrong, help wouldn't be too far off. We arrived just before dusk, the last bits of daylight slipping away behind the thick trees as we unloaded the truck. The chill in the air made me pull my jacket tighter around myself, the scent of pine and fresh earth mixing with the dampness of the evening. Jake was quiet as usual, carrying the bulk of the gear while I handled setting up the fire pit. It was a bit of an odd mix. Jake being the tough, law and order guy, and me, the guy who didn't usually spend a lot of time away from the comfort of my own home. Still, something about the woods calmed me down. By the time we finished, the sun was gone, and the only light was from the fire. The flames crackled as they consumed the dry wood, casting long, dancing shadows on the trees. It was the kind of fire you could stare at for hours, lost in thought. I pulled out a beer from the cooler and leaned back against the wooden deck, taking in the peace. Out here, there wasn't a rush. No one was calling.
No texts. No noise.
Just the fire, the woods, and the night. But as the hours passed, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything major, just a nagging feeling at the back of my mind that I couldn't quite shake. I told myself it was the isolation. I hadn't been this far from civilization in a long time, and the quiet seemed unnatural. It wasn't that I felt scared, but the woods. They had a way of making me aware of how alone I was. Jake didn't seem bothered by it. He was the kind of guy who could sleep through anything, gunshots, sirens, the world falling apart. He had this way of shutting out everything that wasn't important to him. So, as the night wore on, he retired to the cabin while I stayed by the fire, watching the smoke curl up toward the sky. Then I heard it. A twig snapped. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far off either. I stood up slowly, trying to focus on the noise. I could feel my heart beat a little faster as the thought crossed my mind that it could just be an animal. But no animal I knew of would step so carefully. There was a rhythm to it, almost like someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't quite succeeding. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left by the fire and walked toward the source of the sound, my steps muffled by the thick layer of leaves covering the ground. The beam of light cut through the darkness, the shadows of the trees reaching long across the forest floor. There was nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone. I felt stupid. The woods could play tricks on you, especially in the dark. I turned around to head back to the cabin, telling myself it was nothing. Then I heard it again, this time much closer. My breath caught. It was a crunching sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves, only it didn't stop. The pattern was irregular, but it was definitely human. My first instinct was to call out to Jake, but I knew that would only make things worse. If someone was out there, making noise like that, they weren't looking to make friends. I swallowed hard and turned to head back toward the cabin. But then, something else caught my attention. The light from the fire was barely visible through the trees, but there was a figure standing just outside its glow. I froze. I couldn't make out much, just a shadow standing still. But it was the shape that got me. It was too tall, too still, and something about it didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way the figure blended into the trees. Maybe it was the absolute silence that followed its arrival. I waited for what felt like an eternity, not daring to move. I couldn't see any details, no face, no clothing, no movement. But I could feel it. I could feel eyes on me even if I couldn't see them. I took a slow, shaky step back, and that's when I heard it. The sound of something heavy brushing against the trees. It wasn't the wind, I could tell that much. The movement was too deliberate. I turned around quickly and sprinted toward the cabin, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I heard footsteps following behind me, quick and purposeful. I slammed the door behind me and bolted it shut, panting. Jake was still inside, sitting at the table, his back to the door, but I knew he heard me. The unease in the air was thick, and I could feel him watching me without saying a word. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond right away, but I saw him stand up, his cop instincts kicking in. He grabbed his gun from the table and headed toward the door. "Stay here," he said before walking outside. I stood there, not moving, my mind racing. It wasn't until I heard him shout, something I couldn't make out, that I knew I had to act. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the signal was dead. Of course it was. I rushed outside, hoping to make sense of what was happening. But when I stepped into the yard, I saw Jake standing in the middle of the clearing, staring at something. The expression on his face was one I'd never seen before. He wasn't a guy who got scared, but there was something about the way he looked at the trees that chilled me to the bone. There was nothing there, nothing I could see at least, but Jake's eyes were wide, his hand gripping his gun tightly, his body rigid. "Jake?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He was still staring into the trees, and that was when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, unlike anything I had ever heard before. It was coming from the direction Jake was staring. The noise was strange and haunting, like an animal, but more primal. Jake's grip tightened on his gun, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "That's not right," he muttered under his breath, taking a step back toward the cabin. I didn't argue with him. I knew that whatever was out there wasn't something we were prepared for. We had no weapons, no backup, and no way to get help. We stayed inside the cabin the rest of the night, barricading the doors and windows, trying to ignore the sounds outside. Whatever was out there was circling us, getting closer. We could hear twigs snapping, branches moving, like something was walking around the cabin, circling, testing us. It was the worst kind of feeling, knowing there was something out there but not knowing what. By morning, whatever it was had disappeared. The woods were still, the usual morning birds singing, and there was no sign of anything. We didn't stick around to investigate. As we packed up to leave, Jake was quieter than usual. I think whatever we heard the night before had shaken him more than he was willing to admit. When we finally pulled out of the driveway and hit the main road, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The kind of dread you get when you know something is out there and you've narrowly escaped it. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't think I'll ever know. But whatever it wasn't human. And we weren't going back to that cabin. Not ever again. It was the middle of autumn, a cold October morning. The wind had a chill to it, swirling fallen leaves along the path I walked. I had just turned 23, but I was already used to being on my own. Growing up, my dad's best friend, Brian, always had stories about his days as a park ranger, working in some of the most remote areas of the mountains. I'd heard all about the cabins, how they were supposed to be secluded, a place for the rangers to rest when the weather got rough or when their work took them deep into the woods. Brian had been telling me about an old, forgotten cabin. It wasn't on any official maps anymore, not really, but he'd gone out there once or twice when he was younger. Over time, the cabin had been abandoned, left to fall apart under the weight of the years. But Brian had always told me there was something unsettling about that place. Something about the isolation, the quiet. It stayed with me, always in the back of my mind. This time, though, Brian didn't say much about it when I asked. He just mentioned, "It's out there. Just be careful." So, that's how I ended up walking through a thick, old-growth forest in the middle of nowhere, armed only with my backpack and a flashlight that I was pretty sure was just about to give out. I had been hiking for hours. The terrain was rough, and the deeper I went, the quieter it got. The wind had died down by then, and all I could hear was the crunch of dry leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. I remember thinking it felt strange, like the air itself was too still, too thick. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew there was nobody else out there. I had hiked into remote areas before, but this place felt different. The trees were so dense that daylight barely filtered through. I had a map, but it was old, and the markings were barely legible. Eventually, I came across something I hadn't expected, an overgrown path. It was almost impossible to see, barely a foot wide, but it was there. I decided to follow it, unsure if I was on the right track, but knowing that there was no turning back. The longer I walked, the more oppressive the silence became. The air was colder now, and the trees seemed to stretch up forever, blocking out any light. The path led me to a clearing, and there, partially hidden by the trees, was the cabin. It was exactly like Brian had described, an old, dilapidated structure, looking like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was weathered, covered in moss, and parts of the roof had collapsed. The windows were boarded up, and the door was hanging off its hinges. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached it, but curiosity pulled me forward. I hadn't come all this way to turn back now. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. The front door was open, or at least what was left of it. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open further, the hinges squealing in protest. Inside, everything was covered in dust, and the air smelled stale, like something long forgotten. It looked like it had been abandoned quickly. There were old belongings scattered around. A chipped mug on the counter, a torn blanket draped over an armchair, a dusty lamp that still sat on a small table. It all seemed so out of place, as if whoever had left hadn't meant to leave, or maybe had left in a hurry. I took a step deeper into the cabin, my flashlight flickering as I swept it across the room. The walls were lined with shelves that were mostly empty, but I could see a few things scattered around. A small, rusted stove sat in the corner, with a pile of wood beside it. A table in the center of the room was covered in old papers, most of them unreadable now from the rot and age. I picked up one of the papers, squinting at the faded writing. It was a log, but it was mostly unintelligible. Something about weather conditions and routine checks. There was a small line at the bottom of the page that made me pause. "Keep watch. Something's not right. I put the paper down, feeling a creeping unease. I didn't know what that meant, but the longer I stayed, the more uncomfortable I felt. I moved toward the back of the cabin, past a door that led to a small bedroom. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside, the room was mostly bare. A cot lay against one wall, the blanket still neatly folded. On the floor beside it, there was a small trunk. I bent down to open it, but just as my fingers brushed the latch, I froze. There was a noise from outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch falling, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A slow, dragging sound. I stepped back from the trunk, my heart racing. My mind went into overdrive, trying to make sense of it. It was coming from the direction of the porch. I crept back into the main room and looked through the broken window. There was nothing at first, just the forest. Then I saw it, a figure moving between the trees. A man, or at least it looked like a man, moving slowly, dragging something behind him. My pulse quickened. The figure was tall, and the way he moved was unsettling, like he wasn't quite walking, more like he was shuffling. I froze, unsure of what to do. There was nowhere to hide in the cabin. I glanced around, looking for an escape, but the only way out was through the front. I wasn't sure how long the figure had been there, or how long he'd been watching me, but my gut told me I was in danger. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing. My heart hammered in my chest as he stood there, unmoving, as if he was waiting for something. I didn't know what he was waiting for, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I turned and ran toward the back of the cabin, not daring to look out the window again. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I had to get away. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. I ran through the woods, hearing nothing but the sound of my own feet pounding the ground. The wind had picked up again, and the trees creaked in the gusts. Eventually, I found the path again, though I didn't know how I had strayed from it in the first place. I followed it, not daring to look back, pushing myself harder, faster, until I finally emerged from the forest and into a small clearing. I wasn't sure how far I had gone, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not yet. When I finally made it back to the road, I collapsed on the side of it, gasping for breath. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. I didn't know what had happened back there, or who that figure was, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin. Not ever. I later found out from Brian that the cabin had been abandoned for years, and no one had gone near it in a long time. The ranger who had been stationed there had left abruptly, and there were rumors about strange things happening in the woods around that cabin. But no one ever really knew for sure. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard that day, but I know one thing. Some places are meant to stay forgotten. Some places are better left alone. And the park ranger cabin was one of those places. It was one of those weekends that felt like a lifetime ago. Perfectly peaceful, but loaded with a sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. I was 27, trying to escape the noise of the city for a few days. So I rented a small, isolated cabin in the woods. The weather was crisp, and the leaves had just begun to change colors. The kind of fall that made everything seem like a picture from an old postcard. The cabin was tucked away in the backwoods of northern Michigan, miles away from any town or road. The kind of place where you can't even get a signal on your phone. I was okay with that, maybe even excited about it. I'd read about this place online. The reviews were a little strange, but the overall sentiment was good. People spoke highly of the cabin's seclusion, its charm, and the surrounding landscape. It seemed like the perfect way to escape for a weekend, to disconnect from everything that had been wearing me down. I hadn't planned to bring anyone along. It felt like the kind of trip where I just wanted to be alone with my thoughts, maybe read a book or two, take some walks in the woods, and enjoy the quiet. The drive up had been smooth, despite the winding, narrow roads. When I finally arrived, the cabin was just as it was in the photos, small, wooden, with a little porch that overlooked a lake. The air was thick with the smell of pine and wet earth. I could hear the sound of the water lapping against the shore and the rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. There was something about the place that felt old, but not in a creepy way, more like it had stories to tell, if only it could speak. The inside was cozy, just one big room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a worn-out couch. The floor creaked underfoot, and the smell of wood and dust filled the air. There was a bed in the back corner, its frame sturdy, though the quilt on it looked like it had been there for years. I set down my bag, opened the windows to let the cool air in, and then sat down in front of the fire. That night, everything was peaceful. The quiet was different from the noise of the city. There were no cars, no voices, not even the hum of electrical devices. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of something outside. I felt relaxed for the first time in ages, maybe a little too relaxed. By the next morning, things started to feel a little different. It was subtle at first, just a slight change in the air, like something had shifted overnight. I woke up to the sound of something scratching against the outside of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. There was a definite rhythm to it, like something was trying to get in. I stood up slowly, walked over to the window, and peered out, but I saw nothing. I tried to brush it off, maybe a raccoon or something, but as the day went on, the feeling in the air seemed to grow heavier. I went out for a walk in the woods, hoping the fresh air would clear my head, but even the trees felt off. The branches stretched higher than I expected, their shadows hanging lower than normal. It wasn't so much that the forest was frightening, but there was an unfamiliar tension, a sense that it wasn't quite as it should be. Still, I ignored it, chalking it up to the isolation. After all, it was the kind of place where things felt a little too quiet. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I had just finished making dinner when I noticed the scratches again. This time louder, more pronounced. They came from somewhere near the back of the cabin, and there was a subtle vibration in the walls that I hadn't felt before. My heart started to race. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but the way the sound shifted, sometimes quick, sometimes slow, sent a cold wave over me. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check. The night was pitch black, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. The flashlight barely cut through it, the beam trembling as I moved toward the back of the cabin. The scratching continued, now louder, almost frantic, and I could hear something else, something like breathing. I turned the corner of the cabin, but there was nothing there. Nothing but a few scattered leaves and the cold wind rustling the trees. I stood frozen for a moment, straining to hear anything else. But the sound had stopped. I didn't know what to think. I considered the possibility that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear or even a wild dog. But there was something about the way it moved, how the scratching sounded like it was coming from the wall itself, that made me hesitate. Animals don't scratch with that kind of rhythm. That night, I decided to lock all the doors and close the windows tight, even though the air had been so fresh earlier. It was hard to fall asleep, but eventually, I drifted off. The house creaked in the silence. It wasn't until I heard something that I knew for sure. This was no animal. The scratching came again, but this time, it was louder, more desperate. It felt like it was coming from inside the walls of the cabin. I sat up in bed, my breath coming short and fast. I grabbed the flashlight again, but as I stepped toward the door, I heard it, a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I've never been the type to jump at every little noise, but there was something about this place that made my skin crawl. Something about it wasn't right. The whisper turned into a soft knocking, came from the back wall of the cabin. There was no mistaking it now. I knew someone was trying to get inside. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the kitchen. It felt foolish to be standing there, shaking with fear, holding a knife, but what else could I do? I walked slowly towards the door, turned the lock, and stepped outside. The forest was even darker than before, the trees looming tall and silent. I kept the flashlight trained on the back of the cabin, but when I turned the corner, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The wall was scratched, deep gouges carved into the wood, as though something had been trying to claw its way in. I stared at it for a long time, trying to process what I was seeing. And then it hit me. The scratches weren't from an animal. They were from something much stronger, something more deliberate. The whispering started again, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from inside the cabin, from the very walls themselves. I rushed back to the door and swung it open, but as I stepped inside, I felt it. Something was waiting for me. The room was cold now, and the fire I had left burning was nothing but a pile of embers. There was a pressure in the air, a weight that made it hard to breathe. I could feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see anyone. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that made the walls shake. I grabbed the knob and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The walls were closing in. It took everything I had to stay calm, but I knew I couldn't panic. I knew I had to get out. I ran to the windows, but they were sealed tight, the wood warped from the cold. My mind raced, but every direction I turned, I kept hearing it. Scratching, whispering, the sound of something scraping against the walls of the cabin. I don't know how long I spent in that cabin. Time felt like it had stopped, the world outside frozen in place. Every sound in the woods felt like it was closing in. The scratching had become deafening. The whispers turned into words. The words turned into screams. I didn't know if they were coming from me or the walls anymore. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the cabin went silent. I found the courage to turn back toward the door, and to my surprise, it opened without resistance. The night outside was still, the air cold and sharp. The moon hung low in the sky, and there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the eerie quiet of the woods. I left the cabin that night and I didn't look back. When I finally made it to the nearest town the next day, I found out the history of that cabin. It had been abandoned for years before I rented it. The locals spoke in hushed tones about strange occurrences in the area, about how the cabin had a long history of people disappearing. People who went in looking for peace and came out with nothing but fear in their eyes. They said it wasn't the forest that was dangerous. It was what lived inside the walls of that cabin. It was the kind of quiet only the deep woods could offer. The Amazon rainforest, known for its towering trees, vibrant wildlife, and thick undergrowth, was an unfamiliar landscape to me. I had never set foot in the Amazon before, but my friends and I were eager for a secluded getaway. We rented a small cabin in a remote area of Brazil, far enough from civilization that there were no distractions, no other visitors, just the wilderness. I was 28 years old, an experienced hiker and camper, so the isolation didn't bother me. I was used to nature, to the sounds of animals in the night, the rustling of leaves, and the distant calls of birds. But nothing could have prepared me for the way this place felt different. From the moment I stepped onto the cabin's porch, a strange tension seemed to hang in the air. The heat was unbearable, the humidity sticking to my skin as I breathed in the thick, damp air. The air was alive with buzzing insects, the occasional cry of something I couldn't identify in the distance. The cabin itself was small, weathered, with wood that looked ancient and darkened from years of exposure. But it was cozy enough for the few days we planned to stay. The first day was uneventful. We unpacked, got settled, and spent the afternoon lounging around, talking about our past trips and catching up on life. The evening came quickly, and we made a small campfire to roast marshmallows and share stories. But as the fire crackled, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It wasn't a physical presence, not like an animal, but a more subtle, unnerving feeling that something just wasn't right. When darkness finally fell, the cabin seemed to shrink, the shadows creeping in from the corners of the room. The forest outside seemed to grow louder, the chirps of insects blending with the strange calls of animals I couldn't place. I tried to brush off my discomfort, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar setting. But as I lay in bed that night, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. I froze, straining my ears. Came again, this time louder, followed by a slow, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone or something was knocking. I lay still, unsure whether to investigate or to ignore it. But the noise didn't stop. It grew more insistent. I cautiously got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the door to the porch, stepping outside into the oppressive heat. The night was still. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees in the wind and the hum of insects. There was nothing, no sign of any animal, no movement from the shadows. But something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a cold sweat forming across my forehead. I stepped further out, shining the flashlight into the trees. The beam of light cut through the dark, revealing nothing but dense foliage and thick vines. I turned around, intending to go back inside, but then I saw it, a faint trail of footprints in the mud, leading from the forest directly to the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. The prints were too big to be animal tracks, too deliberate. Someone had been here, but why hadn't I heard anything? Why hadn't I noticed it earlier? I didn't waste any time. I locked the door and drew the curtains shut, trying to ignore the gnawing fear that twisted in my stomach. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a local had wandered up to the cabin to check on us? But the tracks didn't make sense. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one was supposed to be here. The next morning, I reluctantly told my friends about what happened. Of course, they brushed it off, telling me I was probably just spooked from the unfamiliar place. We decided to head out on a hike through the jungle, hoping the daylight would offer some comfort. The dense canopy above provided a welcome break from the sun's heat, but the strange feeling from the previous night didn't leave me. The trail we followed led deep into the heart of the forest, the ground soft underfoot, the air thick with humidity. We hadn't seen any signs of wildlife, save for a few birds high in the trees. But then, as we rounded a bend, we came across something that stopped us in our tracks. It was a small clearing, and in the middle stood a series of stone pillars, weathered and covered in moss. They didn't look natural, their shapes too precise, too arranged. The ground around them was cracked and disturbed, like something had been dragged through it. Something in the air shifted, and I felt that same unease creeping back. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just an old structure from a bygone time, maybe even the remnants of some indigenous site. But it felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced around, half expecting to see eyes watching from the trees. We quickly left the clearing, but the unease lingered. We didn't speak much as we hiked back to the cabin. When we returned, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The air around the cabin felt heavier, like the weight of the trees themselves was pressing down on us. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if something was really wrong, but the cabin felt off. That night, the noises came again, louder than before. There was no mistaking it now. Something was outside, scratching, tapping. This time, I didn't go out. I stayed in bed, holding my breath, praying it would stop, but it didn't. The noises came closer. It sounded like something, or someone, was pacing back and forth around the cabin. The next morning, we discovered more signs of disturbance. The footprints were back, more numerous this time, leading around the cabin as though something had been circling it. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was an animal, a large one, but the prints didn't match anything I knew. They were too human-like, too deliberate. We decided to pack up and leave, but as we started to gather our things, we noticed something that froze us all in place. The door to the cabin, which we had locked the night before, was wide open. The lock was undisturbed, but the door itself had been swung open from the inside. Panic set in. I was the first to make a move, grabbing the bags and heading toward the truck. The others followed quickly, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating, the air thick and oppressive as we hurried to leave. Just as we reached the truck, I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper coming from the woods behind us. It wasn't words I could understand, but the tone, it was like a warning, a threat. I didn't look back. We didn't talk much on the drive back to civilization. I kept my eyes glued to the road, the gnawing fear still simmering in my chest. We never spoke about what happened at the cabin again, and I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Whatever had happened there, I knew it wasn't over. Something followed us. I'm sure of it. And now, every time I go into the woods, I can feel it. Something watching, something waiting. The memory lingers, a presence I can't escape. I try not to think about it, but I can't help it. The forest was alive in a way I'd never understood. It doesn't forget, and neither do I.